Some wounds don't bleed. They just stay there, buried under your smile, under the weight of every day that passes as if nothing happened. But I know better. I know what it means to wake up each morning and pretend the nightmare ended just because the sun came up. My name is Viola Snyder. Around here in Harper's Ferry, folks call me Miss Vi or just Grandma Vi. I'm 78 now, and most days you'll find me on the front porch of my white farmhouse, a warm pie on the windowsill, and a Bible open in my lap. I sell baked goods at the Sunday market and knit scarves for the grandkids at the church down the road. I smile. I wave. I keep busy. That's what people think healing looks like. But the truth is, healing doesn't always look like a clean scar. Sometimes it looks like waking up alone in the same bed where someone once made you feel like nothing. Sometimes it sounds like silence when you cry and no one answers. And sometimes it starts with telling the story you swore you'd never say out loud. I lost my husband, David Snyder, when I was only 31. He was the kind of man who still held my hand at the grocery store, who carved my name into trees like we were still teenagers. When he died in that accident on the highway, a part of me was buried with him. But I never imagined that the man who would hurt me next wasn't a stranger. It was someone who shared his last name, his father, my father-in-law. This story isn't easy to tell, but I'm telling it now because someone out there needs to know they're not alone. Maybe it's you. Maybe it's someone you love. Either way, I'm here, and I'm ready. I was born in the spring of 1947, when Harper's Ferry still felt like a forgotten corner of the world. Nestled between the Blue Ridge Mountains and the winding Potomac River, the town had more church bells than traffic lights and more secrets than people dared to admit. My parents, Robert and Helen Snyder, raised me and my two younger brothers in a modest, creaky old house just off Washington Street. We didn't have much, but what we lacked in money, we made up for in love and old-fashioned values. Daddy was a blacksmith. He came home each evening covered in soot, his hands rough and cracked, but he never missed the chance to scoop me into his arms and call me his little flower. Mama was the quiet, sturdy kind, the kind who could feed 5 mouths on scraps and turn sorrow into strength without ever raising her voice. She sang hymns while she cleaned, and I used to lie under the kitchen table just to hear the melody float through the house. There were no fancy vacations or shiny presents, but I remember those days as golden. We were raised on respect, church on Sundays, and supper at 6. Mama taught me to pray before I could read. Daddy taught me how to tell the truth, even when it hurt. Life was simple and sacred. The world outside might have been turning faster, with civil rights marches and war on the news, but inside our home, time moved slowly. Summers were for picking blackberries and catching fireflies. Winters meant huddling by the fireplace while Daddy read from the Bible or told us stories about the old days. I was a quiet child, a bit shy, always with a book or a journal in my hand. While other girls dreamed of city lights or Hollywood stars, I dreamed of becoming a teacher, of having a little classroom where I could help kids find their voices. But in our part of the world, dreams like that weren't for girls like me. By the time I turned 16, the pressure to find a husband was louder than any dream I dared to speak. That was when I met David Snyder. He was 2 years older than me, with a smile that made your knees forget how to stand. He wore his Navy uniform with the kind of pride you only saw in boys who'd grown up knowing struggle. His family owned a farm on the outskirts of town, a bigger place, with chickens and apple trees and a barn that leaned like it had secrets to keep. David was gentle. He'd walk me home with my books, never once trying to kiss me without asking. And when he did kiss me under that old sycamore tree behind the church, I thought my heart would leap clean out of my chest. My parents were hesitant. David's family was known for being traditional. His father, Carl Snyder, was a strict, somber man who rarely smiled unless it was Sunday, and he was sitting in the front pew like a statue. He didn't say much to me when we first met, just eyed me up and down like he was measuring something. I brushed it off then. I was too in love to see shadows. By 18, I was married. We moved into the Snyder family home. As was expected, it's a big house. David had said, plenty of space for all of us until we get on our feet. I didn't mind. At the time, it seemed practical. David worked long shifts at the armory, and I stayed home, helping Mama Snyder in the kitchen and keeping the house clean. Carl mostly kept to himself, sitting by the window in the evenings, smoking a pipe and reading the paper like the world outside didn't interest him. Life wasn't perfect, but it was peaceful. David and I would sneak away some nights, lay out on a blanket in the fields and dream about having kids, maybe building a little cottage of our own someday. He promised me the world in those quiet moments, and I believed him. Every word. Then came the accident. A truck ran a red light. Just like that, David was gone. I remember the sound of the officer's knock, the way Mama Snyder fell to her knees, the way Carl stood motionless, staring at the wall like he'd known it would happen. I was a widow at 31, with a heart torn in half and no place to run. I wanted to go back to my parents, but Carl insisted I stay. Your family, he said. David would have wanted you here. At the time, I believed him. I thought he was grieving too. I thought maybe we could heal together. I didn't know then what that house would become. At first, it was little things, Carl telling me what to wear, what to cook, when to leave the lights on. He said it was just how the house runs. I tried to adapt, to be respectful. I still called him Dad. I still made his tea each evening like Mama Snyder used to do. But she passed not long after David. Some say it was heartbreak. Others said pneumonia. Either way, her absence left me alone in that big old house with a man I didn't truly know. Looking back now, I see the signs, the long stairs, the way he hovered in doorways, the times he entered my room without knocking. But when you're grieving, you cling to anything that feels familiar. I told myself I was imagining things, that he was just old-fashioned, that he meant no harm. But deep down, something in me had already started to flinch. The house grew colder, even as the seasons changed. My laughter faded. My voice got quieter. I stopped writing in my journal. I stopped dreaming. And still, I stayed. Because I had nowhere else to go. Because the world doesn't open its arms to widows the way it does to young brides. Because I was taught to endure, to obey, to make do. I didn't yet know that surviving meant more than staying alive. It meant finding the strength to name the darkness, and eventually to escape it. But that part of my story hadn't begun yet. All I knew then was silence, and the feeling that my soul was slowly slipping through the cracks in that old farmhouse. It happened slowly, like rot beneath floorboards, quiet, creeping, and dangerous only once it was too late. After David's funeral, the house shifted. It wasn't just the way it echoed without his laugh, or how the bed felt too big at night. No, it was the presence of Carl Snyder, my father-in-law, filling every space. He was always there now. Sitting in David's chair at the kitchen table, standing by the window with a cigarette, watching me as I swept the floor, asking questions that felt more like commands. How much sugar did you use? Why are you wearing that dress? David always liked your hair pinned back. Keep it that way. At first, I thought it was grief. Men like Carl didn't cry. They didn't fall apart in front of others. They tightened their grip on everything around them instead. So I forgave the sharp tone. I told myself he was hurting, same as me. But then came the touch. The first time, I was bent over the stove, checking the cornbread. He passed behind me and let his hand linger too long on my back. I froze, the heat from the oven pale compared to the fire racing up my spine. I turned to look at him, searching for some sign that I'd misunderstood. He just smirked. "It's nice having a woman in the house again," he said. "Gets lonely around here." That night, I slept with a chair against the door. The days that followed brought more moments like that. Subtle at first. A brush of the shoulder, a comment on the shape of my legs. One morning I found him in the kitchen wearing only his undershirt, sipping coffee like it was his living room, and I was his housekeeper. I wanted to leave, but where would I go? I had no job, no savings, and no family left who could take me in. When I brought up the idea of moving out, Carl's eyes darkened. "David's name is on this house," he said flatly. "He would want you here, not wandering off like some wild girl. You're a Snyder. You belong here. That wasn't love. That was a prison sentence." The next time he crossed the line, there was no mistaking his intentions. I had just stepped out of the shower and reached for the towel when I heard the door creak. Carl stood there, staring. He didn't flinch, didn't apologize, just closed the door and walked away like nothing had happened. I stood there, shaking, gripping the towel like it could protect me from the truth. The truth was, I was no longer safe. Not in that house, not with that man. Still, I stayed for weeks, maybe months. Time blurred. I told myself I needed to plan, to save money, to find a way out that wouldn't leave me sleeping in a shelter or under a bridge. But really, I was terrified. Not just of Carl, but of what people would say if I left. A widowed daughter-in-law leaving her grieving father-in-law. That's not how things were done in our town. People would whisper, and I'd been raised to avoid scandal like the plague. He began coming into my room at night. Sometimes he didn't touch me. He just stood there, breathing, watching. Other nights, I won't describe it. Not because I don't remember, because I remember every second, but because some pain doesn't need details to be understood. It lives in the silence between words, in the crack of a voice, in the way a woman walks faster past certain doorways. I scrubbed myself raw each morning. My skin burned, but it never felt clean. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't cry loud enough to drown the shame. And yet, no one knew. At church, I smiled. I shook hands. I brought casseroles to potlucks. I sat in the same pew where I'd once held David's hand and stared at the same stained glass windows, praying for rescue, for a sign. But there were no miracles, just one small thing. In the attic one afternoon, I found a letter, tucked inside an old shoebox of David's things. It was one he'd written to me before his last deployment, but had never mailed. "My dearest Vi," it began, "if anything ever happens to me, promise me something. Promise you won't stay quiet. You always had the softest voice, but the strongest spirit. Don't let anyone take that from you. Not even for me, especially not for me." I read those words over and over, my hands trembling. I hadn't heard his voice in years, but there it was, firm, loving, and clear. It was the sign I needed. That night, when Carl knocked on my door. I didn't answer. I sat in the corner of the room with the letter pressed to my chest and prayed for courage. I began to plan. In the following days, I hid small bills inside empty flour tins and coffee cans. I told Carl I was visiting the cemetery more often, but really, I was walking into town, speaking to people quietly. Reverend Thomas Green was the first person I trusted. I didn't tell him everything just enough. His face went pale, then hard. He offered me a place to go, said his cousin Lorraine in Tennessee ran a home for widows and women in need. She's quiet, doesn't ask questions, he said. You could start fresh. Fresh. I hadn't tasted that word in years. I waited one more week. I sewed the letter into the lining of my coat, packed a single suitcase, and made one final casserole for Carl. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't leave a note. I left while he was asleep in his chair, his mouth open, snoring like a man who had stolen peace from another and claimed it for himself. I walked until the sun came up. Then I got on the bus. As it pulled away from Harper's Ferry, I looked out the window and let my tears fall. Not because I was sad, because I was free. But escape is only the beginning. Healing, that takes something deeper, something slower, something earned. And I had just begun. I arrived in Tennessee with nothing but a single suitcase, a weathered Bible, and David's letter stitched into my coat lining like a secret heartbeat. The bus station smelled of fried grease and cigarette smoke, and I remember how the early morning light came slanting in through the high windows, cutting the cold like a blade. I stepped off that bus, feeling hollowed out, like I'd left pieces of myself behind in every room of that cursed house. Lorraine Mathers met me just outside the depot. She was shorter than I expected, but carried herself like a general. Her hair was cropped tight, gray at the roots, and her eyes were the kind that didn't flinch. She wore an old wool coat and kept her hands buried deep in her pockets. When she saw me, she nodded not with pity, but with a kind of knowing. "You, Viola?" she asked, voice rough as gravel. I nodded. "Then let's get you home." Home. I hadn't heard that word spoken to me in a long time, not without the sound of chains behind it. Lorraine's house sat on the edge of a quiet road, backed up to a patch of pine trees and wind-worn fields. It wasn't big 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, and a porch that creaked like a song. But it was clean, safe. There were no locked doors, no watching eyes, no footsteps in the hallway at night. I slept for 3 days straight. I don't remember dreaming, only waking and realizing I didn't have to brace myself anymore. But trauma doesn't vanish. It doesn't obey the calendar. Even in silence, the memories whispered his breath at the door, the feel of my skin crawling in the dark, the way shame stuck to me like a second skin. Lorraine never pried. She gave me space. She fed me. And when I finally found the words, I told her everything. She didn't gasp. She didn't shake her head or offer tired platitudes. She just reached across the kitchen table, laid her rough hand over mine, and said, "You're not broken, Viola. You were brutalized. That's different. And you're still here. That means something." That was the beginning of my healing. At her suggestion, I joined a small women's group at a local church, not the kind full of gossip and empty verses, but women who had clawed their way out of things no one should live through. There was Beth, who'd escaped a husband that broke her nose more times than she could count. Clara, whose uncle had raised her and taught her to fear every creak of the stairs. And Marcy, who hadn't spoken a full sentence in years but held your hand like she meant it. We didn't talk about pain every time. Sometimes we just sat and knit. Sometimes we baked pies together. Sometimes we cried without words, and that was okay. I got a job at the town bakery, washing dishes at first, then slowly helping with early morning prep. My hands remembered how to knead dough, how to measure cinnamon by scent alone. There was something healing in baking flour and sugar and fire, all transforming into something warm, something good. I moved into a small apartment above the bakery after 6 months. It had peeling paint and a heater that rattled in the walls. But it was mine, every inch of it. I bought yellow curtains. I planted petunias in a chipped pot outside the window. I started keeping a journal again, writing not just about the past, but the present. I began to breathe again, but not without setbacks. One night, walking home, I saw a man on the corner who moved like Carl, same broad shoulders, same slow shuffle. I froze, my chest tightened, breath caught like a fist in my throat. It wasn't him, of course, but my body didn't know that. I ran all the way home, locked every door, and sat in the bathtub shaking until morning. That's what people don't understand about trauma. It doesn't disappear when you leave. It follows you in shadows and smells and sounds. It takes patience and kindness and time. It was a year before I laughed again, really laughed. I remember the moment. Beth had told a joke so bad it made Clara snort, and I couldn't help it. The laugh rose up out of me like it had been waiting, and for once it didn't feel wrong. I decided to do something with the strength I was finding. I started hosting Saturday brunches for the women in our group. At first, just 3 or 4 of us, then more. I'd bake muffins, fry bacon, pour orange juice into mismatched glasses. We talk about our weeks, our struggles, our wins. We built something in that room, a sisterhood forged not just by pain, but by survival. I took a night class in bookkeeping, then another in small business planning, with help from Lorraine and the church ladies. I applied for a loan. I bought the bakery when the owner decided to retire. I renamed it Vi's Morning Light. It wasn't about selling pastries. It was about having a space where no one ever had to feel afraid. A place where women who had been told they were nothing could walk in and feel like queens. We hired survivors. We offered free coffee to anyone who needed to sit a while. I kept a small stack of pamphlets about shelters and crisis centers in a drawer behind the counter, just in case. Then, one spring morning, after 6 years of silence, I got a letter. The return address said Harper's Ferry. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a short note. The handwriting was familiar. "Mama, I'm sorry I didn't come sooner. I looked for you. I asked Reverend Green, and he gave me your address. I'm married now. I have a daughter. I want you to meet her. I want to come home. If you'll have me." It was signed, Emily. My Emily. The baby I held in my arms the night I ran. The girl I left behind because I thought I couldn't protect her. She'd been living with her aunt in Virginia all those years. I had sent letters once or twice, early on, but they never got replies. I thought she'd been lost to me, but there she was, in my hands again, wanting to come home. I wept, not from guilt this time, but from grace. When she arrived, we stood on my front porch for a long time, just looking at each other. Her eyes were David's, her chin was mine. She held her daughter's hand and said, "Mama, this is Grace. She's named after what brought me back to you." I knelt and held my granddaughter close, whispering into her curls, "You come from strong women, sweetheart." Don't you ever forget that. That day, my life began again, not because the past was erased, but because I'd survived it. And now, I was no longer just Viola the widow or Viola the runaway. I was Viola the mother, Viola the baker, Viola the woman who found her light again, one morning at a time. The day I opened the bakery under my own name. Vi's morning light wasn't marked by grand ribbons or camera flashes. No big crowds, no speeches, just a soft drizzle falling on the windows and the smell of cinnamon rolls rising in the oven. But to me, it felt like stepping onto sacred ground. I had spent so many years trying to survive in the shadows of men, my father, my husband, and then Carl. Now, at 67 years old, I was stepping out into the light on my own 2 feet. Business was slow at first, but word spread fast in our little Tennessee town. Folks came for the honey biscuits and stayed for the peace. I always greeted every customer with a warm smile and a cup of coffee, and it wasn't long before Vi's morning light became a refuge not just for the women in our support group, but for anyone looking for a moment of quiet comfort. But the peace didn't last forever. One Monday morning, I was behind the counter rolling out dough when I heard the bell above the door chime. I looked up, and my heart dropped straight into my shoes. Carl Snyder, older, grayer, and walking with a cane, but still him. He stood there like a ghost come to life, his eyes scanning the place like it belonged to him. "Well," he said, voice low and gravelly, "I didn't think you had it in you. I didn't speak. Couldn't." The room tilted. My hands trembled. I was just passing through. He added, "Saw your name on the sign. Thought maybe I'd come in for a taste of that sass I remember." It was like the years peeled away. I was no longer Viola the survivor, Viola the businesswoman. I was that broken widow again, standing in a kitchen too afraid to breathe. But then something unexpected happened. Marcy came out from the back room. She had flour on her apron and a rolling pin in hand. She saw my face, then looked at Carl. Her body stiffened like a shield. "You need something?" she asked him, cold as stone. Carl chuckled. "I was just saying hello." Marcy didn't blink. "Then you've said it. Now you can leave." He turned back to me, eyes narrowed. "You really gonna let her talk to me like that?" I stepped out from behind the counter. My knees were shaking, but my voice was steady. "She's right," I said. "You've said enough in your life. Carl, you don't get to say anything else here." He scoffed and shuffled toward the door. Still the same ungrateful girl. "No," I said, louder now. "I'm not the same. And you don't get to call me a girl. I am a woman, a survivor, and you are not welcome here." He stopped, turned slowly. "You think you can erase the past?" "No," I said quietly, "but I can build a future where you no longer exist." He didn't come back, but his presence shook me to the core. I couldn't sleep that night. The memories I had fought to bury came back like a flood. The smell of whiskey on his breath, the feel of the chair under my doorknob, the hollow sound of his voice through the walls. For a moment, I wanted to run, but then I remembered something Reverend Green told me long ago. The past only wins when you surrender the present. The next day, I opened the shop like usual, and I baked his favorite pie pecan, buttery and golden, and I gave it away to the shelter down the road. I took something he loved and turned it into nourishment for others. I reclaimed it. That's when I knew I was ready. Ready to fight for more than just my survival. Ready to stand for others who hadn't found their voice yet. I contacted a local lawyer, an old friend of Lorraine's, and started the process of founding a nonprofit. We called it the Morning Light Foundation. Its mission was simple: provide emergency housing, job training, therapy referrals, and a safe place for women escaping domestic abuse. At first, it was just the room above my bakery. Then we bought a small duplex, then another. A local business donated supplies. Volunteers came, and the community began to shift. We hosted workshops, how to handle money, how to write a resume, how to rebuild your confidence. The women came in afraid, broken, and they left steady, standing tall, holding their own house keys. I told my story publicly for the first time that fall, at a town event hosted by the church. I stood behind a wooden podium, my hands trembling but my voice clear. I didn't give graphic details I didn't need to. I told them what it was like to feel invisible in your own home, what it meant to pray for the courage to run, what it felt like to finally be seen. There was silence when I finished, then applause, and then women began to come forward one by one, sharing their own wounds. I had opened a door, and they walked through. Years passed. The foundation grew. Emily joined as a counselor after earning her degree. Grace, my granddaughter, helped paint the new shelter walls every summer break. The bakery became a symbol, not just of good food, but of something sweeter, freedom. One evening, after closing up, I sat on the porch with Emily watching the sky turn from gold to purple. "Mama," she said softly, "you know what I remember most about you?" I smiled. "What's that?" "Baby. You never stopped showing up, even when you were broken. You kept showing up. For me, for yourself, for all of us." That night, I wrote in my journal, "This is what reclaiming a life looks like. Not revenge, not forgetting, but showing up, day after day, until the pain becomes purpose." I had once been a prisoner in my own home. Now, I had helped build 27 new ones. And I wasn't done yet. Starting over in my late 60s wasn't just about escaping the man who'd stolen my voice. It was about learning how to use that voice again loud, clear, and without apology. The Morning Light Foundation had given me more than a mission, it had given me purpose. Each woman who walked through our doors reminded me that we were part of something bigger than healing. We were part of a quiet revolution. We were proof that no matter the past, it was never too late to begin again. But starting over doesn't mean the road is smooth. The first few years were tough. Money was always tight. Donations came and went. There were times I had to choose between paying the electric bill for the shelter or refilling the bakery's flour stock. I'd go home at night, kick off my shoes, and rub my aching feet, praying that I was doing enough. There were times I doubted myself deeply. Nights I'd sit alone, staring at the letter from David I kept on my dresser, and whisper, "Am I doing what you'd want me to do?" And even though no voice ever answered, I always felt something, a warmth in my chest, a kind of stillness that told me yes. I started writing more, not just in my journal, but essays and reflections about what I'd lived through. I submitted one of them to a regional women's magazine, and to my shock, they published it. Then came speaking requests, radio interviews, even a small TV segment. And with visibility came impact. More survivors started calling. Some came from other states. Some showed up with nothing but the clothes on their backs. We made space. We made beds. We made promises that they would be safe, heard, and never alone again. Still, the weight of the past clung to me in unexpected ways. One summer, a young woman arrived at the shelter in the middle of the night. She was no more than 20, barefoot, clutching a little boy who couldn't have been older than 3. Her arms were bruised, her eyes blank. She didn't speak for 2 days, but on the 3rd night, she walked into the kitchen where I was brewing tea, sat at the table, and whispered. He used to come in my room at night. I thought it was my fault. I didn't say anything right away. I just placed a cup in front of her and sat beside her. Then I said the words I wished someone had told me long ago. It was never your fault, and you're not alone. She cried, and I held her. We stayed there until morning. That moment reminded me every scar we carry is a lantern for someone else. And some days, healing meant letting go of the shame I didn't even realize I was still carrying. One day, I walked past a mirror and saw myself as if for the first time. The gray hair I used to resent now felt like a crown. The laugh lines weren't reminders of aging. They were signs I had lived deeply, survived, loved. I bought a new dress that week, bright yellow. I wore it to the bakery on a Saturday. And when one of the younger girls said I looked like sunshine, I laughed until tears ran down my cheeks. That same month, I enrolled in a course at the Community College Creative Writing for seniors. I sat in a classroom with people from all walks of life, most of them retired, all of us carrying stories aching to be told. I started writing about David, about my childhood in Harper's Ferry, about the house I fled and the home I built in its place. My professor, a woman just a few years younger than me, pulled me aside after class one evening. You should publish this, she said. Your story isn't just yours anymore. It's a light for others. So I did. At 74, I published a memoir, not a bestseller, not a headline maker, but it found its way into the hands of women who needed it most. I got letters, emails. One came from a nurse in Pennsylvania who wrote, "Reading your words saved my life. I didn't think I had the right to leave, but now I do." Each of those messages lit something inside me I thought had gone out a long time ago. Hope. Meanwhile, my family grew. Emily, my daughter, had become a licensed counselor and was working full-time at the foundation. She handled intake assessments, led group therapy, and organized healing retreats in the nearby Smoky Mountains, watching her sit with women, hold their pain, and gently guide them toward their own strength. It was like watching a miracle unfold every day. My granddaughter Grace was in high school by then, smart as a whip and bold like her daddy. She called me Nana Vi and loved nothing more than sneaking into the bakery after hours to eat raw cookie dough and quiz me on American history. She dreamed of becoming a lawyer one day to fight for people who don't know how to fight yet. I told her she already was. Every holiday, our little home was full. Women who had once lived in the shelter now returned with their children, bringing casseroles and cranberry sauce, filling the house with laughter and clinking dishes. We weren't related by blood, but we were family. And even Carl's shadow began to fade. He died before I ever saw him again. I received a formal letter from a lawyer in Harper's Ferry offering to settle a small inheritance he'd left behind. I declined it, told them to donate it to the local women's shelter instead. He had taken too much already. I wouldn't take anything from him, not even an apology wrapped in dollars. And just like that, the final chain snapped. I was free. In the spring of my 75th year, I stood on the front steps of the newest Morning Lighthouse, our 5th shelter home. We cut a ribbon and named it Grace House, after my granddaughter. Inside, we hung a plaque that read, "From silence, we build strength. From pain, we grow power. From the darkest night, we find the morning light." That night, I sat with Emily and Grace in my living room, the fireplace crackling, our hands wrapped around mugs of chamomile tea. "You've changed the world, Mama," Emily whispered. I smiled, pulling Grace close. "No, sweetheart, we changed it together, and we'll keep changing it one woman, one voice, one light at a time. The sun had just begun to set behind the hills, casting long golden rays across the bakery windows. I stood by the counter of Vi's Morning Light, wiping down the last few crumbs from the day. The room smelled of cinnamon and fresh coffee, but what lingered more deeply was peace, not the kind of peace that comes from silence, but the kind that's earned, rebuilt brick by brick after the storm. I looked around that space and thought about every version of myself that had once felt small, silenced, and scared. The young widow trembling in her bedroom, the woman too afraid to run, the survivor who finally did. She lived in me still, but she wasn't alone anymore. She was joined by the woman who spoke her truth in front of a crowded room, by the woman who founded a home for others like her, by the mother who found her daughter again, by the grandmother who begged for joy and not for approval. We had become one, whole, that night after locking up. I walked the few blocks to the shelter and stood outside under the stars. I could hear laughter from inside, dishes clinking, a lullaby being hummed upstairs, the sounds of life, not just survival, but living. Lorraine joined me on the steps. Her hair had gone nearly all silver now, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She handed me a warm biscuit and said simply, "We did good, Vi." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Yeah, we did. I wasn't afraid anymore, not of shadows, not of memories, not even of time, because I knew if tomorrow came, I'd meet it head on. And if it didn't, I had already left something behind, not pain, not silence, but light. If there's one thing I've learned through the long and winding years, it's this: your past may shape you, but it never gets the final word. You may be bruised, betrayed, forgotten, or afraid, but as long as you're breathing, you can still begin again. You can reclaim your voice. You can build something beautiful from the ashes. It's never too late to become the woman you were always meant to be. If my story touched something inside you, if you saw a piece of yourself, your mother, your sister, or a friend, please leave a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what you're carrying or what you've overcome. Your story matters. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Not for me, but for every woman out there who's still waiting for her morning light. Because when we speak up, when we share, when we stand together, we rise.